Normally we don't hold author lectures here. We don't often get a big turnout, and you hate to invite an author to come and speak and not have a nice audience for them, but you've turned out in great numbers, which proves that history buffs are everywhere, all types of topics. And of course, it's a real pleasure to welcome Tom Flagel here to speak on his new book, A History Buff's Guide to the Presidents. This is one of a series of books with a similar title that Tom has done. He's also done A History Buff's Guide to the Civil War, A History Buff's Guide to World War II, and is the co-author of A History Buff's Guide to Gettysburg. Tom, until very recently, taught at Kirkwood Community College in Cedar Rapids. He holds degrees from Loras College, Kansas State University, and Creighton University, and has studied at the University of Vienna. Excuse me. And I'm sad to say we're losing Tom. He's moving to Columbia State Community College in Tennessee. He's, I think the winter just, he qualifies as winter kill, maybe. He just said, enough is enough, and he's moving to Tennessee. But he's also closer to where the Civil War took place, books he's working on. So this may be your last opportunity to see and hear Tom, and also to get him to sign your copy of A History Buff's Guide to the Presidents. But he's also brought copies of some of his other books, which he'll be selling from that table in the back. He'll talk for about 30 minutes or so, then take questions from you, and we should wrap up by 4 o'clock. So, Thomas and our flight. There's a couple of seats here, and we'll close the doors.
Well, thanks so much, Tim, for having me here. It's a pleasure, and thanks for coming. Today I'm going to be speaking about, of all things, presidential pastimes. And why is this important to look at something that seems to be so trivial? I think it's because it reflects so wisely not only how the presidents have changed, but how our country has changed. I mean, at the beginning of the presidency, it was like some sort of altruistic martyrhood that these men had. They all said, and many of them truly felt, they hated the job. James K. Polk insisted, no president who performs his duty faithfully and conscientiously can have any leisure. Thomas Jefferson lamented, I consider the presidency daily drudgery and a daily loss of friends. Andrew Jackson equated it to slavery. It's rather cruel considering he had slaves. Benjamin Harrison would walk in front of the White House, point to it and say, there is my prison. But then, an entirely new message comes in the 20th century, greatly exemplified by the dynamic Teddy Roosevelt. He says, no other president ever enjoyed the presidency as much as I did. His distant cousin FDR said, the presidency was the grandest job in the world. Even Herbert Hoover in his darkest days said he had fun. Bill Clinton admitted, I love this job. Even in the worst of times, the whole impeachment thing, I just thank God every day I get to go to work. So what happened from the 19th century to the 20th? How could it be that it's such misery and then suddenly it's right to celebrate? It was something that was invented by the Industrial Revolution, something that we really didn't ever have before. Leisure time. It used to be that leisure time only belonged to the wealthy. And with the idea of the rise of the machine, the concept of spectator sports or vacation started to emerge for the first time in human existence. And presidents started to change their tune because leisure time was becoming available to the middle class and the lower middle class. Even some of the working class could go out and see sports for the first time. It was not only right and proper for a president to celebrate the concept of leisure time, it was almost patriotic. It used to be belonged to the wealthy class, and now it's democracy in action, the prosperity of new age and new country. So today I'm going to be looking at a few of the pastimes of the presidents. And we'll be examining how they've changed from generation to generation. I won't tell you what's the #1 pastime, you'll have to get my book to see that. But let's look through this and see how the industrial age started changing it all. I mean, a great example being in 1895 alone. That year, 1895, introduced motion picture cameras, the wireless radio, the American Bowling Congress, the first professional football game. and the first U.S. Open Golf Championship. All of that is at the dawn of a new century. So let's look at these pastimes. Let's start with a very common one, swimming. Right now, swimming is considered a white-collar sport. It used to be everybody, especially the poor, used to swim because you had to. There was no indoor plumbing. We didn't have functional indoor plumbing in the White House until the Rutherford B. Hayes administration in the 1870s. One of our first swimmers, and a very common one, was John Quincy Adams, who after the hot day would go down to the Potomac and go for a swim. He would challenge his old body to see if he could make it all the way across. Most of these guys did it because you bathed maybe 3 or 4 times a year. And time again, more of these presidents and congressmen, senators, governors would swim because everybody else did. But over time, it became a fancy thing to do. We had our first White House swimming pool with FDR, who put it right in the newly refurbished West Wing. He loved it because it allowed him to do something he could not do on land, stand up under his own power. And most of the other presidents loved the idea of swimming. Jack Kennedy, with his Addison's disease and terrible back, truly enjoyed swimming. Had it at balmy 88 degrees. His successor, LBJ, almost got no exercise whatsoever, but the one pastime he allowed himself was to swim. Nixon actually covered the White House swimming pool to make room for a press corps. He knew the value of looking good rather than being good. But Gerald Ford said, enough is enough. I'm going to make a swimming pool right outside of the West Wing, and I'm going to swim in it all the time. The press can come watch me. It'll be enjoyable, which is so sad because Gerald R. Ford was one of the greatest athletes we ever had in the White House. He's seen as some sort of clumsy oaf. He falls down the stairs. He doesn't do too well when he speaks. He's actually one of the finest athletes we've ever had. A boxer, downhill skier, weightlifter. He could swim laps around anybody. And he truly enjoyed the pool, as did every president that followed him. But it's interesting to know, all these presidents, including Teddy Roosevelt, would swim for enjoyment and exercise, but John Quincy Adams, Teddy Roosevelt, LBJ, and Jack Kennedy all swam the same way. Completely naked. LBJ actually had impromptu press discussions, little press meetings inside the White House pool, and he'd be completely naked. It was a way for him to empower himself over others, and trust me, it really allowed for people to maintain eye contact. Another way we have sped up as a nation, one of the greatest pastimes, was walking. Now think of this, LBJ was the first president born during the age of automobiles. Every other president was born in essentially walking towns. The place you got from one place to another was simply by hiking it. John Adams himself, even in his 60s, could do 5 miles in a day without getting tired. He says it's much better than riding a horse, it invigorates him. Another man who loved to walk was James Madison. He liked going at midday. Chester A. Arthur, though, preferred going late at night, even at 3 a.m., totally by himself throughout Washington, which is kind of strange because he inherited the White House when his predecessor, James Garfield, was shot in Washington, D.C. Calvin Coolidge enjoyed a brisk jaunt in the morning, followed by a slower stroll in the afternoon without much guarding. He liked to window shop, so he could forget his troubles. The fastest walker we ever had was Harry Truman. He loved to walk all the time and talk to people that he'd met in Washington. This privilege of his was lost in 1950 when 2 Puerto Rican ultranationalists came to his temporary residence at the Blair House and tried to kill him. Ever after, the Secret Service said, "You will not walk alone, Mr. President." So he had to walk slower because the Secret Service couldn't keep up with him. And we have people who still love to do it. James Carter liked to walk, but one thing that kind of begged him, he liked to walk with Rosalind the only time that he'd really be alone and kind of romantic. Even at Camp David, though, the Secret Service would be right on their tail, and he would look back at Rosalind and say, "Fellas, you're kind of killing the mood." Bill Clinton tried jogging, and then he tried speed walking, and then he tried walking, because he had a weight problem. And then he tried walking right into fast food restaurants because he just didn't have the discipline to keep with it. But it reflects that we are a nation speeding up. Speaking of speeding up, believe it or not, one of the most popular pastimes of all presidents was reading. Not so much our current president, but I give him a break because he majored in history. Before his eyesight totally failed him, George Washington loved to read newspapers to his wife. He didn't like to read when company was around. He thought it to be the most offensive thing to do. Jefferson's collection eventually became the seed corn of our Library of Congress. Lincoln preferred Byron, Poe, Shakespeare. His favorite was Macbeth. He oftentimes read aloud, which really annoyed his secretaries. James Garfield enjoyed Jane Austen. Cerebral Woodrow Wilson, the only president to get a PhD, enjoyed reading all the time, but he had to do it very slowly because he suffered from dyslexia. But even this, we're accelerating over time. The presidents would read faster and faster and faster. A great example being Jack Kennedy, who would read mostly newspapers, including the Des Moines Register, but he would read them at 1,500 words a minute. And nobody read any faster than Jimmy Carter, 2,000 words a minute. He thought it was so productive, he taught his entire staff how to speed read. One great example of pastimes, the way we used to do things slower, was card playing. Almost every president in the 19th century played cards. James Garfield loved euchre. Poker was an ancient game, but it was introduced in the United States about the 1820s. Grover Cleveland thrived on it, loved the game. FDR and Truman played for small pots inside the White House. The most skilled players undoubtedly were Dwight Eisenhower and Dick Nixon. They made a ton of money to supplement their very, I wouldn't say bad pay, but rather humble pay during the armed forces. And Ike in the Army and Tricky Dick in the Navy would actually make hundreds of dollars playing poker because they were so good at reading other people. But once they got into the White House, they stopped doing it because they knew they were so good. They couldn't turn that competitiveness off, and they played a little bit lighthearted games. Nobody enjoyed poker more than Warren G. Harding. Loved poker games, and he was bad at it. One time he bet a China set from the Benjamin Harrison administration and lost it. He would have friends like William Wrigley Jr. and Blackjack Pershing play, and his Secretary of Treasury Andrew Mellon would play. And it's hard to express this. Harding's not my favorite, and I have to be objective as an historian, but he would have this almost like rowdy kind of parties at the White House. The First Lady, Florence Harding, would mix drinks, and this during the time of Prohibition. It was illegal to buy it, it was illegal to sell it, it was okay to have it. And she was sitting there making up drinks, and everybody's having a great time. One of his cabinet members came by saying, well, this is the way to network. He doesn't go to meetings all the time. Warren G. Harding, I can't find him. He's partying all the time. That guy enjoyed the presidency far more than I enjoyed college. But he would go to one of these poker games, and he sat in once. And he saw the behavior, and he saw the drinking, and he saw the high stakes. And he said, this is disgusting. I'm not coming back. And that cabinet member was Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover. Hunting and fishing in a time when it actually was a practical thing to do, when we were actually a starving nation. It was mixing business with pleasure, if you will. You had to hunt or fish to live. We had presidents who hunted. Washington loved the fox hunt, so did his lookalike James Monroe. John Tyler was, by many accounts, a phenomenal shot. Grover Cleveland liked to gun down game with a gun he called death and destruction. Making up for lost time as a sickly boy, Theodore Roosevelt loved hunting, and he would hit anything and everything because he shot often. His eyesight was so bad he just simply had to use ammunition to fell something. An example of how much he loved it, right after his presidency was over, he went on an African hunting safari with one of his sons, and they bagged over 500 animals, including antelope, elephants, giraffes, hippos, hyenas, leopards, lions, rhinos, warthogs, waterbucks, wildebeests, and zebras. And strangely enough, no president had more pets in his family than Theodore Roosevelt. They had roosters, they had horses, they had dogs, a go-go, cats everywhere. It's as if Theodore Roosevelt befriended everything he didn't shoot. Yes, a question in the back.
Is it true that Roosevelt would occasionally ride up and down the mall and shoot birds?
Ride up and down the mall and shoot birds. Well, he would actually go out in the countryside. Something his eldest daughter would do, Alice. And I do know that he would drive around the Washington countryside in an open car and shoot at trees with a pistol just for fun. Whether or not he did that in the mall, I'm not totally sure. And we must remind ourselves, the mall was not a heavily populated place during the administration of Roosevelt. It was rather an open area. Washington, D.C. was built on a swamp, and somebody says it hasn't changed that much recently. But in reality, yeah, it was far more wide open. I mean, they made this city out of nothing. And really, the population hasn't exploded until the last 80 years, really. So whether or not that's really true, I'm not sure, but he did go around the Washington countryside, which is now totally populated by development, and just shoot stuff randomly. I can't help but like Teddy Roosevelt. He's like a Stanley Kubrick film. You either love him or you hate him. And I think I would have loved him. I would have avoided him when he had his gun, but I really would have enjoyed him. As far as other hunters go, or you can go on to fishing, I should say, really, was another popular pastime. And again, it's one of the things that all Americans did when the life was slower and you had to eat. New Yorker Martin Van Buren was truly one of our first fishermen. But no president loved fishing more than Franklin Pierce. He talked about it all the time. In fact, all 4 of his addresses to Congress involved stories of fishing or laws involving fishing rights. FDR liked to fish at a place called Shangri-La, a place that is eventually later known as Camp David. But one of our best fishermen was Herbert Hoover. But he did not allow himself any time to go fishing. He had a job to do. No sick days, no vacation. I have a problem here in the United States. I don't have time to do vacation work. Until he lost the 1932 election. And before FDR got sworn in, he would allow himself to go fly fishing in the Shenandoah, just to get away from it all. There was one president who hated fishing and hunting with all his heart and soul. There was Abraham Lincoln. When he was about 10, he shot a turkey, very close range, and when he saw it suffer and die, he promised himself never to do it again. Little trivia question: when is the first president ever to throw a baseball, the first pitch at a baseball game? Anybody?
Garfield?
You're getting close.
Coolidge.
Think big. It's William Howard Taft. Yeah, he's baseball and presidency is always firmly connected to each other, but most of these guys were too old to play it in the White House. They just didn't have the energy. Teddy Roosevelt being an exception. He used to play with his kids. And our current president doesn't mind throwing the ball around every once in a while. Yes, question in the back.
I see Herbert Hoover selling a baseball ticket to some other presidents when he was young.
That I don't know. I'll have to look that. He was heavily involved in baseball. You can see him as a cabinet member going with Coolidge to baseball games at Old Griffith Stadium in Washington, D.C.
This is like the school baseball game or something, and Hoover insisted the president buy a ticket.
I wouldn't doubt it. That man knew thrift, and he knew that everybody was responsible. It's one thing I do love about Hoover. He has a sense, despite being a millionaire by age 40, despite having traveled the world, despite being fluent in Mandarin and German, he was able to realize he got that way from very humble beginnings here, largely on his own. And instead of being elitist and say, most other people can't do this, he said, most other people can do this. And no president is above me. So it's entirely possible that actually did happen. It's one of the reasons why I love the man. But back to Taft, he's better known at the time, not for baseball, but for a game he helped make popular. His doctor said, listen, Howard, you're a little big. You're nearing 300 pounds. You need to get out. Try this new game called golf. And he does. And the press lambasts him for wasting hours that most Americans don't have yet, to go play this game and chase it around all these links. And then people go, that looks fun. And this new British game takes off in the United States and never comes back. Most presidents who followed him loved playing the game. One guy really had a hard time with it, could hardly ever crack 100 for 18 holes, was Woodrow Wilson. He would often say, this is a game where you have an ineffectual attempt to put an elusive ball into an obscure hole with implements ill-adapted to the purpose. Even on a good day, 100 was beyond him. Obviously, there is one president who is synonymous with golf, and that being Dwight David Eisenhower. He would play 150 games a year. And people criticized him constantly. He even put a little putting green on the south lawn and practiced putting, and sometimes that wasn't quite enough. When he couldn't get out to the links outside Washington, he would practice his chip shots, and sometimes those got a little boring. And sometimes he'd try longer chip shots, and maybe on occasion, a few of them got a little out of hand, and they would fly over the White House fence into Midtown traffic. Jack Kennedy learned, I can't do that. I can't suffer the kind of publicity damage that Ike is suffering. But I love golf. I was on the Harvard team. I'm excellent. He was a much better golfer, but he knew to do it secretly. When he had any time, he would be shuttled out for a small game with friends outside Washington. And he shot in the 70s, quite often. Poor Gerald Ford. Again, one of the finest athletes we ever had, but golf was a little elusive for him. He would often say, I know I'm playing better golf because I'm hitting fewer spectators. And our current administration, golf runs in their blood. Both are very good golfers. Again, they try to avoid it. H.W. was an excellent golfer. George now is avoiding it because of that terrible clip of him saying, look at these terrorists, now watch me hit this drive. And he promised himself very recently never to play golf while president again, and he hasn't. He still bikes, he still walks, he still hunts, he still travels, but he doesn't play golf. But again, it is in their blood. His great-grandfather was a president of the United States Golf Association. One last, Hoover Ball. Only one guy played it. Nobody else wanted to really emulate what he was doing, but this is what's so wonderful about Hoover Ball. Herbert Hoover, in fighting the greatest economic depression ever to hit the globe, and I must remind my readers and students, this was a global thing. Europe was preferring authoritarian dictatorships than hard work among people. They were going towards strange men and strange ways to solve it. But Herbert Hoover believed in the United States and said, we cannot go down that path. The individual can do this, and I can do it. I will work 14 hours a day if I have to. I will eat in 10 minutes if I have to. Yet my exercise is still important, and I don't have time to golf, or fish, or hunt, or play cards. I know a game I saw on a ship on my way to South America. And his presidential physician and he himself invented the game called Hoover Ball, a combination of tennis and volleyball, and a game called Bull in the Middle. And they played it from 7 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. sharp. There was a whistle on the Potomac that blew, and if the game was still tied, didn't matter, gotta quit, go back to work. Cabinet members, congressmen knew this is the time to talk to him, and they would play out there, rain, wind, cold, snow. Half an hour, full body workout, get back to work. That embodied Herbert Hoover. And we embody this new thing called leisure time. Right outside this door, we have the National Hoover Ball Championship going on. We have the Iowa State Bicycle Road Race Championship going on 3 blocks away from here. Some of you may have played frisbee, horseshoes, little basketball, throw the ball around what you got here. You are in this room, in a building created in the 20th century for the concept of travel, exercise, enjoyment, family time, leisure time. You and I embody this industrial revolution that continues to make us go faster and faster and faster, and yet we must realize we have more and more and more things to do that our great-grandfathers and great-great-grandfathers and presidents didn't have time to do. We are a nation on the move, and it's wonderful. With that, I thank you, and I will open that up to more questions and answers. And comments. I love to hear what you people think. At the end, when I really sound brilliant.
Did any of them play croquet?
I never really read anywhere where many of them took to the game quite often. It was fashionable for women to play it. Golf was the natural maturation of it when women weren't allowed on the links. Many men played bridge until poker became popular. So the first ladies played bridge and the men played poker. Cigars were the cigarettes for the men. Whenever during the Eisenhower administration, after dinner, the women and men would go in separate rooms, where the women would have coffee and cigarettes and the men would have brandy and cigars. Croquet was one of those games where it was considered too effeminate, especially when there were presidents to play. They played golf. Good question. Yes.
They say that this president takes more vacations than any other. However, how can you really remove yourself from this job? I mean, you've got to be available 24/7, 365, right?
That's part of it. He's in constant connection all the time. There is something called a football, where a lieutenant colonel keeps with him all the time. That is the launch codes for our weapons of mass destruction. There is the internet, there's Air Force One. You can be any place at any time. Exactly, you're totally connected all the time. When they say he's in vacations, he's still getting daily national security briefings. He's still in connection with his cabinet members. Yes, he set a record for it, but we can look back at the John Adams administration, where he got so fed up with Washington, he took a 7-month break to go back to Quincy, and trust me, he wasn't in all that much connection. Yeah, that's exactly right. We ride him rather hard. But then again, it's a hard job. We must remind ourselves, we've had 42 presidents. I don't count Grover Cleveland twice, but you could. He weighed around 300 pounds himself. The only president to serve non-consecutive terms. And yeah, this is, 8 men have died doing this out of 42. 4 of them by gun wound. Seriously, I don't care how good the healthcare is. I don't want that job. Think about that. Would you wish this job on your worst enemy? When I was growing up in grade school, it was, you could grow up to be President of the United States. And now, with no personal safety whatsoever, and, well, yeah, personal safety, but at the same time you have so little character security, the press is on you perpetually. Would you wish this job on your worst enemy? You make a great point. In the last 50 years, I mean, really since Kennedy, when you could have affairs and could be private, now you can't belch without half the country knowing about it in 3 seconds on YouTube. It is a perpetual job. Yes, sir.
I heard the vice presidents usually just stay at home instead of actually coming to Washington in the first place. Just kind of stay at home and wait for the president to maybe die. When did that change? When the vice presidents actually start living in Washington and actually doing their job?
Great question. There was one vice president, I believe, under, I'm trying to think it was under Roosevelt or Wilson. Now it's escaping me. I'm growing old myself and slowing down. But he would say, there's an old joke for vice presidents that a woman had 2 sons, and one went off to the Navy, into the sea, and the other one became vice president, and nobody ever heard of either one of them again. Yeah, this is a job people don't want. It's a type of almost. And you know, there's another situation. We've had 9 vice presidents die, but you're right. You're waiting around for something to happen. You can have tie-breaking votes in the Senate, but that's about it. The Cold War is when it starts to become a job where you have to be prepared, you have to be connected, you have to be in Washington, D.C. at all times. This is a great question because we run into a situation where we fear our world will be wiped out by a nuclear bomb in seconds. We need that vice president in charge, ready to go, prepared. And that's when it starts. We start creating something called the survivor clause. Every time the president makes an address to the Congress, his annual address, you will have the White House make sure there will be a senator, there will be a representative, there will be a cabinet member, and there oftentimes will be the vice president not in attendance. Somebody's got to survive because we could be wiped out in minutes. Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, in regard to the attitudes for the vice presidency, really that's how Theodore Roosevelt became president, because people didn't like him for his reformist ideas when he was in New York. So wasn't it Senator Platt who was the head of the machine there, and said, we got to get Roosevelt out of our hair. What's the best place to put him? Let's nominate him to be vice president. He'll disappear into oblivion.
The whole idea behind LBJ, the whole idea behind John C. Calhoun, who eventually quit the vice presidency to become senator from South Carolina again, because he said, they're hiding me. I'm powerless. You're totally right. It was one way to get somebody out of the way.
Yeah, then McKinley gets shot 6 months later, and whoops.
Somebody said, do you imagine this Teddy Roosevelt, a 42-year-old psychopath, compared to the conservative William McKinley?
Well,
that guy is one bullet
said,
away from the White House. And
Mark Hanna said that,
yes,
that
exactly.
damn cowboy is now president of the United States.
Yes, it drew people insane. And how did they find him at the time? He was out hunting.
He was on a hike up in the Alleghenies. Yes,
they had to go find him. It took him 8 hours to track down the actual president of the United States. It's just, yeah, this is the perpetual presidency, exactly. Yes, sir.
Do you have anything to say about when Teddy Roosevelt put in the tennis courts about the teenagers of the Matacor in Washington, D.C. having to drop 15 years to talk to the president?
Yeah, this is, he's out on a travel excursion out in California, and he's gaining weight because this is a desk job, essentially. And his wife, Edith, goes, I'm going to give him a present. And she has, just outside of this new thing called, what we now call the West Wing, this adjacent building to the White House, she has a tennis court built, the first one at the White House. And he says, I don't have time to do this. And she goes, you can't afford not to do it. You're overweight there, champ. And so he would have this tennis cabinet meetings, and they would have to attend. And diplomats would have to attend and play. Because he said, I don't have time to spare, just like Hoover with Hooverwall. This has to be, I have to play and work at the same time. Yeah, these guys, there are certain presidents who could crunch time, because that's the most valuable thing to a president. You have assistants, you have secretaries, you have experts, you have cabinet members, but you don't have time. An hour is gold. And they would play tennis and Hooverwall tradition. Again, LBJ would go to the bathroom and have the press people follow him in and say, I don't have time to take 5 minutes break, you got to come with me. And again, the eye contact thing. Yeah, it was very manipulative, but he knew what he was doing. He was saving time. Yes, sir.
Well, defining greatness is obviously a personal opinion, but you couldn't have studied their leisure time without studying their traits. What traits, without naming specific presidents, do you think really define those capabilities or assets that make them a truly great president?
This is an awesome question. How can you study their pastimes and delineate their traits with those pastimes? How does it reflect, and how does it make a great president? This is interesting the way we interpret it. Coolidge, not Silent Cal, he had very long inauguration speech and very long press meetings, but he was very reticent about what he did, and so he didn't court the public or the press, and so we get this image of Coolidge being a do-nothing, laissez-faire president, which isn't true. And so you get this idea that he'd go on walks and he would sleep long periods of time. In reality, he was suffering from his depression because his son died playing tennis at the White House, got an infection on his toe, and eventually passed away. And while he's president of the United States, he goes into depression and doesn't know how to court the press and say, listen, I work hard every day, but now I need my space. And so they say, you're not a good president. Another great example, Herbert Hoover, working 14 hours a day. He's a phenomenal man. Saying the American people could do it. Forget about military solutions. Forget about the Cold War when he's an assistant or an advisor to many presidents. Our problems are here at home. But the American people can do it. All they have to do is appeal to Main Street and we can get it fixed. And he's considered one of our worst presidents. Jimmy Carter says, very green in his attitude, we are running out of oil. We're dependent on countries that are not friendly to us. And he's saying this in a sweater and turning down the thermostat in public buildings and taking fewer international trips. We have to conserve, we have to conserve. And he's considered an idiot, and Ronald Reagan, who flies all over the world and spends a ton of money and has these lavish parties, is considered a genius. It's the presidents that embody this kind of leisure time that are considered great presidents. The go-getters, the spenders, the doers, the shakers, the movers, whoever they may be, those are our great presidents. The conservative, the reticent, the ones who don't want to blow their horn, the ones who take their spare time and make sure they don't really exaggerate what they're doing, though what they're doing is incredible, are considered failures. We are image conscious. Some presidents knew it, some presidents didn't, and it was very well expressed through the way they spent their spare time. Excellent question. Yes, sir.
Did you say that Woodrow Wilson was kind of a combination of those two?
Yeah, he was. I mean, here's the only PhD president we've ever had. He celebrates a common man at the same time he's a bit of an elitist. He has this tendency, one of the great pastimes he did was mock other ethnicities, and he had a great talent for mimicry. And yet he's in Europe championing the idea of democracy. Get rid of all these old monarchies. You don't know how to run your life. I know how to run it. We're Democrats, we're Americans, we're the best. And yet you'll mock the common man. He is a dichotomy. He's a hard one to measure, a great president and an annoyance. And this is what's so fascinating. Once you get into these people and start studying them, we turn them into stone and bronze. And we pretend that's what they were. These are living, breathing human beings who need fun and exercise and, in some cases, a little discipline. Good question. Yes, sir.
Based on your answer to the previous question, we're probably going to see a basketball court built in the White House soon.
It's entirely possible. Barack Obama loves to play a little pickup basketball, and he's not bad at it. He's going to be one of our first basketball players. We know that he's not much of a bowler. He had just appealed to the common man, which these people do, and he's an Ivy League man who's rather brilliant, works very hard, never had time to do much leisure. Went out and during the campaign trail and bowled, just to mix with the common people. And in 7 frames, he was bowling at 37. Yikes. Which begs the question, at the bowling alley, was it quarter beer night? Yeah, but he really isn't all that athletic. George W. Bush is one of the most athletic presidents we've ever had. He's got a resting heart rate of around 55. Doctors are amazed with the physical condition he's in. His dad was pretty much the same way, despite being older. If John McCain happens to win, you're going to get a champion wrestler and an excellent former boxer, more aggressive from his Navy upbringing. His father and grandfather were in the Navy. But Barack Obama actually, ironically, the better athlete was McCain. Yes, sir.
Eisenhower was criticized for delegating, but that's a military axiom. Delegate as much as possible, but take responsibility for what happens.
He knew experts. Exactly it. The question being, he delegated quite a bit, and people say he was a hands-off president. We now know that is not true. Eisenhower does very well in my book. And again, I'm an objective historian. I try to remove emotionalism from it. He did not blow his own horn. And as a consequence, was viewed in following generations as a do-nothing president, which is ridiculous. So the National Security Council meetings, he attended 90%. Most of our Cold War policy, domestic and international, he was hands-on. One of the first ever civil rights movement involved Little Rock, Arkansas, and students trying to get into a segregated school. And he was part of it. But he wasn't there to say, it was me, it was me, it was me. That's not Eisenhower. That's not Midwest. And as a consequence, we treat him like he was a non-president until you get into the facts, until you look at the archives in Abilene, Kansas, until you get to know the man better, the flesh and blood man. You start to realize he was quite active. He just wasn't cocky. Yes, sir.
One lighthearted golf story, Jim Castleton, former Tipton, told the story who was out golfing in Colorado when President Ford was golfing. They were on adjacent fairways. And President Ford's ball, miraculously, of course, went into the wrong fairway, which was their fairway. And so the Secret Service came over and said, well, you know, this is the president, he's going to have to go to his ball. And Jim said, no. He says, we have the right of way. He's in our fairway. So the Secret Service guy goes back and tells the president, he looks up and waves and says, right through.
That's Gerald Ford. Again, he was the only president who's had 2 direct assassination attempts, just a few weeks apart, both in California, both women. And the Secret Service says, you have to cut out this meeting with the people stuff. Obviously, it's not good. Some of these people are armed, and some of them are women, and they're mad. Mr. President, stay here where we can watch you. And he said, I don't want to be that kind of president. If I live in a world where I can't meet people and shake their hand, then I don't want to be president. But after those assassination attempts, he did start wearing a bulletproof vest, and he did start the habit, and you can see this after those events. Whenever he shakes hands, he would look at the hands first. But he was still a very common man. Yes.
Who was the other assassin? It wasn't one of them was Squeaky Fromm. Who was the other one?
You'll have to read my book to find it. It's a young housewife. She was connected. Well, you'll have to see it. Yeah, my whole book is based on top 10 lists. The whole series is based on top 10 lists, and there have been 10 direct bodily assaults on the presidents over the years. 4 of them turned out to be mortal wounds, and here's the only president who gets 2 right against him. But again, it's fascinating when you look at men who have been targets. They just take it as a matter of course. When Truman, when he was at the Blair House in 1950, hearing this gunshot, firing several shots going out, semi-automatic pistols going outside the Blair House, the first thing he does is go over to the window and look. And afterwards he goes, well, you're just going to have to accept that. It's going to happen in my job, until he finds out that one private, Leslie Caulfield, died in the process, and then he was traumatized. But for the most part, these men just say, like James Garfield says, I can prevent an assassination like I can prevent a strike from lightning. And he says that because he's a Civil War veteran and he's seen death. But lo and behold, he is killed while being president by an assassin.
Well, I think that Theodore Roosevelt loved to bingle with people too, and one of the big things was when McKinley was assassinated, then the Secret Service wouldn't allow him to shake hands with people, as I understand, for several years. And they had, I think it was on New Year's Day, they had a reception where he was allowed to do so, and the count was that he shook hands with like over 8,100 people in one day when he got a chance to see them all coming through the White House.
And his hand was just swollen.
He made up for lost time.
Yeah, he was one of those people person, a vibrant person. His daughter would say he would have to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, and the baby at every christening. He just needed attention. And to have him be separated from the American public really bugged him. But at this time we must remember, and this is before the Congress actually says until 1906, that's when they actually secure the idea of having a permanent detail for the president. This is 1906. We've had a death in 1865, a death in 1881, a death in 1901. And it takes Congress that long to do something about it. Wow, what a surprise. But yeah, it's, again, the human stories of these men, this is when they become flesh and blood. Yes,
is it true that Garfield was killed by his doctors, not the bullet?
No, that's an old story. This is still 1881 before. This is a great point, though. The concept of germ theory comes up in the 1870s. And they start probing for the bullet, oftentimes with unwashed hands, and he suffers. They eventually take him out of Washington, put him on the seaside, see if he can't recover, and he dies of infection many weeks later. But we don't know. When you're shot the way he was, I mean, the first thing he does when he's hit in the back, when he's leaving Washington, ironically for July 1st, I believe it was, in 1881, for vacation. He was minutes away from being out of the city and to go on vacation. He's hit in the back twice, and he starts vomiting blood. And he says, I am dead. The damage was so massive, it's entirely possible he couldn't have recovered. If he were shot today, more than likely we could have saved him. If he were shot 20 years ago, more than likely we could have saved him. 40 years ago, you're fortunate. We believe that these men are living in the 21st century, and they have 21st century experiences and values, and 21st century doctors. They don't. One great example, I don't want to elongate this too much, and I'll get to your question. One day, Grover Cleveland feels a bump on the roof of his mouth, and he goes, I better get this looked at. And he said, Mr. President, it's cancer. And he's taken back, and he knows we're in the middle of an economic downturn, 1893. If I tell the United States I have cancer, I don't know what the economy is going to do. I already got reelected because the economy was so bad. He goes on a boat offshore and has 3 doctors cut out the upper part of his jaw and insert galvanized rubber for an upper jaw. And we don't know this for well past his presidency. These guys are willing to suffer for what they do. I mean, this one thing I learned. I had my heroes, I had my villains, but as an historian I try to be objective. Some of them, all of them, tried their best and suffered. In a statue, you look at them, they don't suffer. You look at the person, they suffer. Last question, sir.
You mentioned what Lincoln did not want to do, hunt. But no man lived through more stress or even personal sorrows than that man. What did he do? Or did he have a release, or was it just telling his jokes that offered him his pastime?
We know he's suffering from horrible, horrible depression. And one of the ways he fought it was with humor. And one of the things he loved was reading all the time. He said, my best friend is a man who give me a book I ain't read. And deep satire he loved. I mean, he was a man with such tragedy, and he would sit there reading this satire, saying, if I had half his talent, I would give him my job and I would take his. Yeah, I love great satire. And he would read this to the secretaries, and they would go, Mr. President, I'm a little busy. But yeah, he would fight that off with humor. But even then, here's a man who said, I have enough sorrow for the rest of the world. There is a tired spot that can't be touched. I don't know how long he would have lived, had he lived. That just physically, he couldn't take it anymore. He was working 17-hour days. And he knew the suffering. He had been to the hospitals. He had lost his own son from typhoid in the White House. His wife was starting to lose it. He couldn't take it anymore, and half the country wanted him dead. I wouldn't wish this job on anybody anytime. But we must study them and appreciate them, because it's up to us in November to decide who's next. So our job's on the line. Let's do a good job, and thank you so much for having me.